Oh, we're live streaming now. Hello, everyone. I just want to say right at the top that we will be recording in progress, that we are recording this panel, and it will be available on our website and YouTube channel later. And I think those addresses should be in the chat if they are not already. They will be soon. So hi, I am Susan Green with CoLab, the Colorado News Collaborative, and I have a background in criminal justice and civil rights reporting. And thanks for taking time out today to learn about a civil right that's really sort of slow to be recognized in this country, the right to be forgotten. This is the idea that people should possess some ability to make sure that false or damaging information about them doesn't linger forever online. The movement has many tentacles in law and policy, but we're here today just to discuss how this comes into play with the news sector and newsrooms, allowing people to, in certain circumstances, have their names removed from old archive stories, generally in connection with outdated or embarrassing criminal allegations. And recognizing that people should have some degree of control over information about their past, more and more news outlets are trying to strike a balance between the rights of the subjects and the public interest in the information about those subjects. Many of us are old enough that we started our careers in a time when journalists had held steadfast to the idea that news is the first version of history and that it's sort of immutable, it can't be changed. I mean, many in our profession still feel that way. But some newsrooms are taking a more nuanced approach that seeks to distinguish between truthfulness and relevance. Newsrooms are starting to take responsibility in three ways. One, for having printed or broadcast false information, or for not having followed up with reporting that set the record straight if, for example, charges against the subject were dropped or the person was acquitted. Two, owning up to the part of the news media has historically played in hurting people's abilities to get hired for jobs or rent housing or to get a date or otherwise move on with their lives without this albatross of their past or a dumb mistake or a transgression in their past hanging around their necks. In other words, taking some responsibility for people's suffering because of our coverage. And I want to say unintentional suffering, it's a byproduct. And three, asking ourselves how long in the age of the internet people should be dogged by their past after having served their time or otherwise paid their debts to society. The right to be forgotten movement, also called the right to erasure, which is like more of a British way of calling it, first took root in Europe, where the EU enacted a law in 2014 giving European citizens the power to demand data about them be deleted by news outlets. The idea caught on a few years ago, around 2019 in the US, led by efforts at the Cleveland Plain Dealer and Cedar Rapids Gazette. And now policies are popping up nationwide and in Colorado. In Colorado, the Denver Post, under the leadership of Leanne Colosiopo, who's with us today. Thank you, Leanne. Just can you say hi so people know who you are?
Hi, thanks. Good to be here.
Oh, good. We'll get back to you in a second. You quietly launched a right to be forgotten policy in your newsroom in April of this year, and at a much smaller paper, the Aspen Times, under the helm of our former colleague at the Post, editor Dave Krause, who's with us. Dave, say hi.
Hello,
hi,
everybody.
Dave.
Thank you for having me as well.
Thanks for being here and your big bear behind you. More publicly launched a policy in May. I'm grateful that you're both here with us today. I want to note also that in June, the AP announced it will no longer name suspects or run their mugshots when reporting on minor crimes. So really quickly, my informal survey of outlets over the past few weeks leads me to believe that although many newsrooms throughout Colorado have in fact unpublished people's names by quote unquote amending online stories, most don't have written policies on when they'll do so. And very few have sort of indicated publicly what those policies are. So we only have an hour today to hear about policies in Dave's newsroom and Leanne's and how those policies came about and how they're working. We're also hoping to touch a bit on the broader context of recent reforms in criminal justice reporting and on some developments at the state legislature we should all be aware of. If we don't have time for those last two topics, we'll schedule another conversation. So let's jump in. Dave, the Aspen Times is part of Swift Communications. You are one of 7 of the papers here in Colorado, Swift papers, right?
Correct.
Right. And you led the effort to write and make public a right to be forgotten policy for all of those newsrooms. Can you just tell us what prompted the policy and how you went about writing and enacting it, please?
Sure. Thanks, Susan, again, for having me. As you mentioned, I worked at the Denver Post for over 15 years and really got involved more the last couple of years on news side. And when I got to the Aspen Times as the editor here, especially in the community paper, a lot of some of the first emails I got or phone calls I got were people who had been written about previously, wanting to know about, well, how can I get my story removed from a name that, from a story that's 10 years old? So I stewed on that for a while. And as I started talking with some of the other editors in the Swift Communications network, we have papers, as you mentioned, in Colorado, we have one in Park City, we have 2 in the Tahoe area. All of us had dealt with requests like this in some fashion, but we really didn't have a policy or a way to feel comfortable about doing it. And so what we wound up doing is I had a group of editors, I led up a group of editors, and we got a hold of Chris Quinn. I got a hold of him first. And this was right when the pandemic was happening last year. This really started in like January and February of 2020. Talked to Chris a couple of times. He came and spoke to us.
Let me interrupt. Chris at the Cleveland Plain Dealer. Just
Correct.
so everyone knows. Yeah.
Chris Quinn at the Cleveland Plain Dealer. I talked to him probably 3 or 4 times during the process and why they did it and how they got to it. And so we put a group together among Swift editors and came up with different scenarios and things that, based on reading what they had done in the EU, what they had done in Cleveland, and said, for us as small papers, when is enough enough? And when is to the point of, if you've had your record expunged, then, and the court recognizes it, then what is our role to recognize something to that effect? So we worked for about 3 months on a policy and procedures. And also part of that conversation was, how do we cover cops in courts going forward? And that has been a part of our discussion as well. Do we really need to be reporting about misdemeanor cocaine possessions in Aspen, in Breckenridge, or whatever, and then we don't follow up on it? And part of that is the accountability of newsrooms and how they were reporting years ago. And will we do that now? And what is our role? And so that's how it really came about. It came together well. We had a lot of really good conversations. We had a lot of input from all of our editors. And we have a nice 6 or 7 page policy we put out. We all rolled it out at different times. We didn't mandate it. We didn't, we wanted each newsroom runs independently. So we still wanted to have that among our Swift papers. But we also put together talking points, and we published an editorial. We put it out there to people, knowing that when we did that, we would get a large influx and be prepared for that. But we put up a landing page on all of our websites that are doing it, where you can go, and it's really helpful because when people do call us or ask us, we can say, please go start here first.
Yeah.
Here's what you need to do. Our policy is on there so they can click and see what it is: misdemeanors, public facing people, non-violent crimes, no victims. Those are the kind of things that we really talked through when we had our policy discussions.
Great. And I put your policy and your landing page in the chat. I urge everyone to read his policy. It's really thoughtful. And so it's kind of lovely, actually. So check it out. And the landing page is sort of a model for how newspapers could communicate this. Leanne, you set up a similar committee at the Post and also within the Olden-owned newspapers. I'm going to ask you to read a part of the internal policy. You haven't made your policy sort of public yet on a landing page, and we can talk about that later. But there's a really kind of juicy part of your internal policy. Do you mind reading?
Yeah, hang on. This is actually in the, not in the right to be forgotten, but in the breaking news portion, right?
Yeah.
Because I would add that we have two policies kind of going on here. And one is the right to be forgotten. And these guidelines were guidelines we wrote up for our breaking news reporters as they think about what stories we're going to write. So this is the section on naming suspects. Remember that every time you name someone who is arrested, that is a case we must follow and ultimately report the outcome. Be judicious in including arrestees' names if it's not a serious crime. For example, with the George Floyd protests, we did not publish long lists of protesters who'd been arrested. If you're writing up a crime that is most notable for being weird, quirky, funny, like the bank robber caught after a dye pack explodes in his face, the suspect's name isn't crucial to the story. If in doubt, ask an editor. Finally, if you do name an arrestee, you must set up a once-a-week track on that case in CourtLink so that our courts reporter receives emailed updates and can track the case through to its conclusion, which we'll need to report.
Thank you for that. That is a massive change for the Post, for any paper, but especially for the Post, where I know because I worked there for 13 years and covered a lot of criminal justice. Can you talk about what prompted the changes within your newsroom and what kind of buy-in you've had?
Yeah, they kind of were on two related but separate tracks. The right to be forgotten policy was very much like what Dave described, where editors throughout Media News Group had been dealing with increasing numbers of these requests, and really they were, a lot of them had to be pretty sympathetic to, whether they were criminal situations or just that we'd written something that humiliated something like, they did it when they were an intern or something, and when they were 20 years old, and now they're 30. And so the editors in the company were working on that. At the same time, within the newsroom, especially during the time of last summer's protests, and it was just highlighting, all across so many parts of our world, things that weren't being done as thoughtfully as they could be. We developed some guidances around breaking news as we sought to just make better choices, smarter choices, do a better job at really representing our community in a fair and accurate way. And so what I just read, that bubbled up out of the staff and the people who had been reporting these stories, and they wrote that.
Great, thank you for that. I'm going to ask, why now for this movement? Was George Floyd, that case, a factor? One of our participants is asking, was the pandemic a factor and that people have more time to ponder consequences?
For us, the right to be forgotten part had been in the works long before all of that. And it was really, there's no point in repeating everything Dave said, because it was that exact same, it was really the exact problem. You needed guidance, you wanted to be fair about it. You don't want somebody to ask me when I'm in a bad mood to take something down and I'll do it, I won't do it, and then I'm happy I will. Like, you need better guidance than that. And so it was sort of long in the works. I think the part on our coverage of crime and other breaking news, it came out partly, the relationship to the pandemic would be that it did provide a way for the staff to do something together. People who were just stuck at home all the time, there was a hunger, and we were looking for ways for them to be collaborative and kind of have interaction with one another. And then it also was that we sort of looked at our overall breaking news, whether that was crime or traffic accidents or just anything. And we're just trying to be smarter and more focused on what our readers want, rather than just be in reaction to, oh, here's a press release I'm going to knock out while I'm here, and just be more intelligent about it. And then 3, all the issues that arose during the George Floyd protests. So those all, it just was a lucky convergence, I think, that created that moment.
Good, thank you. So let's talk a bit about mechanics, how these policies actually work, as in your requirements for amending stories, what the language of those amendments reads like, who needs to make the request, documentation require, etc. Either one of you can jump in.
Yeah, as you can see, I'll go first, Leanne. As you can see on our landing page, we put some basic windows in their name and a link to the story so we don't have to go chasing it. And then any court documents that they can share with us that will help explain their case. And that's really where we started with it, to try to keep it as simple as possible. And then we get those and I'll look at it first. And we set this well among our newsrooms. Some newsrooms have the option they can meet once a month and have a little committee or a committee. Some people, I might talk to my managing editor, and if it's pretty slam dunk, we're not gonna spend a lot of time on it, because I think one of the things that we learned from the Cleveland model was you're going to get a lot more of these requests, and just try to keep it as simple as possible. And the parameters, if you keep those really simple, then you can say yes and here's why, and no and here's why. And people can, continue to judge, well, if you say no, that's not fair. Well, we feel like the policy we put together is very fair. We don't, if you had a victim crime, we don't certainly want to get rid of that. You should be called out for that. But a lot of it really, as far as the timing went, was just me talking to a lot of the other editors, and it just became such a thing in 2019 after I'd been with Swift for a couple of years, talking to some of the editors and what their, bigger problems or time commitments were. And it was, I just don't know how to handle these. And that's how the interaction started. And I did a little research and found a path.
Okay, so in case people missed it, for you, it's Victimless Crimes, right?
It is, but not public figure. If you're a public figure, if you're, you had a victim of crime, if it's a felony, we're going to really look at a class felony. And I can discuss now, how we amend those stories or what our value is there. But a lot of times, what we really talked about was these stories were true and accurate at the time. So that's not the issue. The issue for us on a lot of these is, at what point should the person still be responsible for a 12-year-old story that we wrote about that, frankly, we probably wouldn't write about it now.
Right.
And so what our value is on the story is we will take out the person's name, we will take out the SEO value name, anything that would relate them, mugshot, anything like that. And then at the bottom, we have an editor's note that says this story was amended on whatever the date was to reflect the person's name was removed as part of our right to be forgotten movement. And here's a link to the policy. And so those are the pieces that we put when we decide to amend a story.
Got it. Thank you. So you literally take the person's name, John Doe, out, and you use the word
man or
the
woman, right?
An Aspen man or an Aspen woman. Okay.
Yeah.
And then can anyone ask for this, or does it have to be the subject, him or herself?
Anyone's welcome to ask for it, but we're certainly, actually, it's a good question. I am working on one from 2 weeks ago. A man who is a sponsor of another man who we wrote about, he's his AA sponsor, wrote about a story, and the man was found not guilty 8 years ago of a crime, and it had to do with him being on drugs and all that. And he was writing on behalf of the man who he's in AA with. And I said, I appreciate that, but I need to hear this from him. And the same thing, I'm not against it, and I appreciate you bringing it to our attention, but I'd like to hear from him as well.
Okay, so you have to have direct contact with the actual subject.
Correct.
What if the actual subject's dead?
Good point. We haven't had that yet. So I think when we get to that road, we'll certainly go down it. But I wouldn't, if a family attorney, if they had the information, I certainly wouldn't be opposed to that. If they had the documentation that we've asked for, they have a good explanation.
Got it. I was interested to see that you added expungement, sort of how to expunge your record on your website. So you're really almost going a step further here and showing people how to really erase some of these embarrassing records. Why did you make that decision?
We made it as a group because we said to people, our baseline is going to be, where we want you to start is expungement, because if we see that from the court, then we respect that. So that gives us a really good starting point. But the reason we did that was, and I've had this happen at least 3 times, people are like, what is expungement? And so you have these people who wind up in the court system and they don't even know how to clear their record. Now, are we going to help them walk through the whole thing? No, but if you've ever wondered about how do I fix my record, well, here's the link and you're on your own. And
Right.
I had a guy email me late last week and said, I'm still working on my expungement papers. This is a lot bigger process than I ever thought.
That,
So
that, that would be a pretty big difference from us. So expungement does not mean we'll take your story down or change it. Or if you've, say, gone through the process and fulfilled the parts of your a plea agreement and maybe your case has been sealed, that would not automatically qualify for us to take your name out. There's one we're fighting with right now where it's a person who was caught in a child sex entrapment or child sex ring, and he did fulfill the parts of his, he pled guilty. And we have not. He thinks that must come down, and but we have not in that case due to the fact that just the nature of the crime. That there's reasons that some of these things should still remain in the public view. So it's not. Some of those things are not. It's not an automatic for us that way.
Got
yeah,
it.
and I would agree. It's I'll clarify, it's not an automatic for us either, but it helps us get the ball rolling. And I think to that example, I think it's totally reasonable and that I would leave that story up too, because there were victims and there was more than just one person involved in something like that.
Got it. I want to thank Tina Griego for sending messages from the audience. Someone asked a great question. Is this a group decision or solely up to the editor? If it's group, who makes the decision in both your newsrooms? Briefly, please.
For me, if it's a cut and dry, if it's just obvious, like the person was, their case was dismissed or something like that, and we've done them before, we have all agreed on a system, I'll just do it. On the ones that are more nuanced, we have a group of senior editors in the newsroom. We meet weekly anyway, and we bring those to that group and have a discussion.
And same for us. I'll take a look at it. Our editors will take a look at it. Some people have set up committees. I always tell my managing editor when I'm going to do something, just to make sure I feel like even if it feels slam dunk to me, I want somebody else to know that in case it does come up. But we've had a couple where I'll take it to our 3 or 4 senior people when we have a bigger one and have a conversation.
Got it. Thank you. Let's talk about what ifs. I think this is a question that nags on us all who do profiles of people in power. What if someone gets charged in their youth for something or maybe even in adulthood, let's say with a white collar crime, fraud, for example, and 10 years later they run for governor or president? Will your having amended those stories make them blind to you in case you need to pull them back?
Well, first of all, it's not like we're systemically going through and erasing all of these. So there would be considerations. So it's not like automatically everything is gone. For us, they're not blind to us because, they would be harder to find, but we leave them in our own in our own company library. So we would still be able to search and find these stories and pull them back up.
Got it. And is that sort of a difficult, costly, time-consuming process or no?
No, that's easy.
Okay. Dave, what about you?
Yeah, I would say the same. We're keeping track of these. And for us, really, a lot of these are, the majority of what I am getting in the past 3 months, a lot of them are misdemeanor, small possession crime stories that, as we've talked, some of the people who were writing these stories 10 to 15 years ago, in Aspen, we still have 2 newspapers and it's a competitive newspaper town. And so there was really a push of find the little details and find the little things. And now I just don't know that we take that same route. So, but we are keeping track. Anything we do change, like I said, I'm keeping a list. I have a email folder. What I do with that for my predecessors is the next conversation we're having, but certainly something that we're keeping track of all of them.
Good, thank you. Dave, you're saying, someone asked how many requests you're getting. I know, Dave, you told me you've had about 9 a month. That takes
Yeah,
about,
I'll get some months I'll get 2, and some weeks I'll get 4 in a week, and so it just really does depend. We had a bit of a push after we posted our editorial about our movement and put the landing page out there. And then I would say I get a steady stream anywhere from 4 to 10 a month, maybe 1 a week.
got it. And Leanne, you said you're getting 4 to 5 some weeks, and there are weeks when you get nothing, right?
Yeah, similar. And I think when we get corporate's trying to build us a page like Dave has, that we can, I imagine you'll see an uptick when that happens, but it hasn't. It's not, I don't know where it is. It's lost in them somewhere.
Got it. Let's talk a bit about who's asking for these amendments. Dave, who are they generally in Aspen?
They are, or they're people, who are here visiting, who probably went a little too hard and treated Aspen like Vegas and didn't think, it would just stay here in Aspen. Those are a lot of them. Most of them are small crime thing, because we say in our policy, if it's a victim crime, it's going to be hard for us to have consideration to take it down. But certainly something to think about. But a lot of the people are, 20 to 30 somethings who are now 30 to 40 somethings or 40 to 50 somethings and want to get jobs. And, when people Google my name, the third thing that comes up is this. And that didn't even, that wasn't how it happened or whatever. And to Leanne's point, these are stories that we wrote about them and then we never followed up on them. And so that accountability part is the hardest part to kind of swallow sometimes in the profession. But for us, it's about, is it the right thing at the right time? And for us, it is, because the internet is, changes. I mean, 10 years ago, we didn't think we'd be able to find, and it just is a lot of conversation that we had. And so we feel comfortable where we are with it. And as things come up and as these, everything is a different request and we treat each one different. And we're learning as we go on this, for sure.
Got
And
it.
a decent number, if I could just throw this in, aren't crimes. They're not criminal things. There are people who are embarrassed by something that was written about them, or just kind of regret ever having talked to us to begin with.
Yeah.
So they might be like a great example, and this is pretty common one, is like we wrote about somebody who was homeless and now, some amount of time has passed, or they talked to us about some like maybe a mental illness issue, or maybe a domestic violence. They might have talked to us about something that wasn't criminally related, and we did a story about them, and now they're looking back and going, I don't really want it out there that I had this happen in my life at some point.
Yeah. Leanne, do you have a sense of the percentage of BIPOC versus white people who are asking for their names to be removed and who's succeeding in doing so?
I'm going to say that it is more predominantly white, I would say. And I think that that's where you do need, that's why we want to get our landing page up and do some outreach on it, because I think, it's often, and this speaks to your who makes the request. We'll get, there's one lawyer in the country who does a huge amount, has made a cottage industry out of this. So it's going to be people who figured out how to get that lawyer. I make them reach out to me themselves, but just because, I don't know, to be difficult, I guess. But but I would say it leans toward people who sort of naturally, have the means, or who believe that they have the power to make these kinds of changes. I would say it leans that way.
Okay, so just to spit back, so I'm really clear what you're saying. It's not in your newsroom. It doesn't help that you have a lawyer, that you're paying for a lawyer to get your
It
name.
does not help. It's not going to be helpful.
And so can you talk a bit, this is a bit of a provocative question, about the naked guy?
Yeah, okay, so, and I can't remember now all the details of this one. There's been a couple like this. So like one example we had was a guy, and it was like 6 or 7 years ago, and he was having something go on in his mind where he thought that he would get out of his car and run around the neighborhood naked. And so neighbors were, police were called, and he was arrested. And we wrote that up as just a little short news of the weird crime brief, and named him. And so now all these years have passed, right? And all he did was run around naked in the street. And I guess he was probably on high or something. And he reached out and said, I had like this mental breakdown. I lost my job over it. He might have been like a sheriff's deputy or something like that. But I lost my job. And now he's not a guy who's made news before. So it was really the only thing that came up on the internet for him. And so that's a really good example of something that we would not write today. It was really just in its most coarse form, just a clickbaity kind of story, right? It was just something to get people to click. And we, that's just an evolution in the industry where that just isn't your core goal. I mean, thank goodness we've moved along from that. And so that's one where our choice was, as I recall, the most extreme version, which is not to delete it completely, but to break all the links and remove it from all search.
I'm glad you mentioned that clickbait thing. That's one really sort of big dynamic that might be the topic for another brown bag lunch, but changes in how we cover criminal justice in general. But I guess also, I think, Dave, you, when we spoke earlier, made a really interesting point. Dave, for everyone who doesn't know him, came up as a sports guy on the sports desk, and then moved, in the last decade to the news desk, first at the Post, Denver Post, and then now at the Times. And you said, you had a lot of trust in the police, and there was a lot of, you both have noted, and everyone who's worked in a newsroom, a small newsroom, knows that sometimes cops, reporters, or whoever's on the cops beat at a certain time might just take what's on the blotter, the police blotter, and write it, right, including the person's name. But then the longer you were on the city desk, the more you came to sort of I guess, doubt the veracity of some of the police reports. So can you talk a little bit about this and how it relates to Right to be Forgotten?
Sure. I think it goes back to that thought that the police can do no wrong, and the majority of them are good people. But unfortunately, there are not good people in every walk of life, including the police department. And so for me, it was a real personal awakening of, I'm a very trustworthy person. I'm a very optimistic person. And even being in a newsroom, I'm still that way. But I just, to the point of the veracity of police reports, right? Just basic writing things based off of police reports only can really put you in a pickle of a situation, because unless you're going to reach out to the person, both sides, then how much faith can we put in what the police report is saying? Because just because the victim said it this way, does that really mean that it occurred? And so for us, really examining these police reports and what we're deciding to write on, and the same as Leanne brought up 100% is, and I just had this conversation 15 minutes ago with my cops reporter about a issue that happened over the weekend with a man assaulting a couple of teens for using the F word in a parking lot. Are we going to run that? And are we going to use his name? And are we going to write it all the way through the courts? And will it get pleaded down to one misdemeanor or whatever? And it's really having those conversations more openly, instead of just, to Leanne's point earlier, just writing it for clickbait because it's interesting and quirky and different.
Got it.
And letting it go.
Got
And
it.
that just didn't sit right. And I gotta really appreciated it a lot more when I moved to the news desk and saw what some of our cops and courts people were writing about, and some of the difficulties they had.
This is a question for you, Dave, again, because I think it doesn't really apply to such a big metro daily like the Post, but there's some in our industry who would argue, especially in small communities, and Aspen might be an outlier on this, that, that kind of like gossipy kind of reporting, naming names of who got arrested, is why people buy newspapers to begin with. What is your response to that?
For us, it's an easy response because our paper is free. So we don't have to write stuff. I mean, surely, our circulation numbers and ad rates are based on how many people pick up the free newspaper. But certainly that hasn't been a thing for us, but more of it, frankly, is about resources and how we're using our resources the best way. And are we going to really commit to covering the community the way we want to and following up and not just leaving a name dangling out there? That's been the biggest thing for us. And I will say the response in the community has been more positive than negative on taking this approach of letting people, have an opportunity and at least an avenue to try to address a situation that's haunting them 10, 12 years later.
Good. Leanne, you've said your right to be forgotten policy is directly tied to your effort to, and I quote, make sure that our coverage is actually reflective of life in our community. And race sort of comes into play here. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, and that's partly, and I think I might have said that or intended that to also include our changes in coverage and our mugshot policy, which has been in effect for quite some time, which is not running all these mugshots. And it's two front, right? It's easy, frankly, it's just easy to write up crime stories. Like press releases come out, the police put it on Twitter, you just knock them out. And so you can end up, and this has been a problem for decades, with a newspaper that has all these briefs about, this and that and the other with a crime. And that's not actually the world we live in, right? There's so much more going on in a community. So that's part of it. The second part is, and this is the sort of thing that you just, it just takes a bit of, being cognizant of the realities of the law enforcement world, but where you do end up with policing in certain communities and maybe, and I mean, there's plenty of reporting to back up the truthfulness of this, where you end up with maybe over arrests in certain communities compared to others because certain communities are over patrolled or certain groups are just picked up more and pulled over more and therefore caught more. And so you can end up, if you report all of those and put all those mugshots up, you end up creating this illusion that your Black and brown population is committing all these crimes and should be really feared. And it's just you're basically picking up the mistakes of law enforcement and now magnifying them across your massive footprint where, we could have, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people a day seeing what we put out. And that's, that's a responsibility you have to take very seriously about what you're saying about your community as a news organization.
Got it. So to both of you, are you apologizing by adopting these policies? Are you apologizing for the past? Are you rewriting the past? That's one question. And another question I have for you is, do you think that these policies, I know it's really early for both of you, they're brand new policies, but have they, or do you see in the future that they will change the public's relationship to your paper and definitely certain audiences' relationship to your paper?
I think that would be, I hope it would be lovely if you could write a policy and do your best to follow it and make mistakes and try again and you could really fix the mistakes of your past and change the relationship of the community. I'm afraid it takes a lot more than that. Yeah. You're going to have to go a lot further than that, but it doesn't make it not worth doing. It doesn't make it not worth doing the right thing, moving ahead. But I think that it would be very simplistic to think that this step would mend broken relationships or make people think like, oh, look, the Denver Post is more inclusive. No, like this is really about doing the right thing, and all the stuff that you talked about is a whole nother step beyond that in my mind.
I would agree with that. I don't know that it's an apology versus really being, as we've been talking about, as transparent as we can with our community and let them know that these are the thoughts and the conversations that we are having. But I think at the end of the day, it's more about that, to Leanne's point exactly, this is what feels right for us right now because of the tone, something that we've had for years and years of being asked about, but not really having a policy toward, and really examining how we're presenting and what we're presenting to people in our community. Is it an apology? I don't think so. I'm not sorry. We're not taking stories down. We're not, are we rewriting history? That's a really good conversation. I feel like we're not changing stories drastically. We're not, like I said, we're not taking them out. We're amending them to give people another opportunity to move on with their life.
Great, thanks, Dave. I want to share something that you told me when we spoke earlier, because it's such a juicy quote. And I think there's so much truth to it. You said, the policy takes down that barrier that the media is holier than thou, and we wrote it, and it wasn't wrong, so screw you.
Yeah.
Sounds just like Dave.
Yeah.
Right. Who do you think I learned some of these things from? And that's the piece, right? I mean, it's changed, and I really have enjoyed coming back to a smaller community newspaper because, I can walk out that door and see three people who I know now, and they'll ask me three different questions about three different stories. And it's that accountability piece more than anything else. I mean, we run a correction when a story is wrong. So to that same vein, we're trying to do what's right and make it, as friendly and forgiving, perhaps, as we can for people who, they deserve a second chance. The court says they get a second chance. And so let's see what our role is in that, and not just turn a blind eye and be the holier than thou that we could afford to be, when I came up in the 80s and 90s, because that's just the way it was.
Good. I'm going to ask Leanna a question in a second, but I really want to invite more audience questions, because I think we've sort of blown through most of them, and I know you guys must have questions. So please hold on for a second. I'm getting a message. We'll think of questions. I'm going to ask Leanne this question, and then we'll get back to a more kind of free-for-all. But Leanne, and this goes back to the sort of other tentacles of the Right to be Forgotten movement, not necessarily in removing people's names from news stories, but Leanne, you told me that a news editor at a conference you went to a while back said to you and your group, you either figure this out, this right to be forgotten thing, or the courts or legislatures will do it for you. And we haven't seen efforts like in the EU where, publications are being mandated to tweak or amend their stories. But we have, while both of you were like in the middle of implementing your policies, the Colorado legislature did pass a right to be forgotten bill this spring. And it shields from public view old arrest records, and criminal records for many kinds of misdemeanors. So for example, landlords don't refuse to rent to people who've been arrested or convicted of misdemeanors. Companies hiring don't pass over people who have those things in their past. And we have word from our lobbyists that at Colorado Press Association that another bill may be coming next session, sealing records about certain kinds of felonies, in addition to misdemeanors. And that said, lawmakers weren't so interested really in hearing the media's arguments about why sealing records can be regressive rather than progressive when it comes to monitoring police misconduct and things like that. So what are your concerns about this kind of legislation? And, can you talk about the sort of realm of whose job is it to police this stuff? Is it newsrooms themselves? Should it be, how do you respond to efforts that really make it harder to, when you need to, access people's criminal records?
Yeah. So the big difference, there's a huge difference in what the Denver Post, a private business, decides to do with information and what the public domain, what the state should agree to make public. These are at their heart, public records and should remain so. Our bit of cautiousness is that, you can just quickly Google a name and it immediately comes up. When you start shielding things like that, what you just said about the felony records is terrifying, because then you really do lose the opportunity to find out that this person who is running for public office once did X, Y, and Z, or take, for example, the police officer who is arrested yesterday, right, in Aurora. Well, he had a conviction in his past that was quite relevant to that story. So when you're trying to explain about all sorts of things, whether it's police misconduct or whether it is describing important crime trends like things about domestic violence arrests, say, and where they're coming, or where are rape allegations being evenly investigated across the city, or there are certain places where things get investigated in the state in a different way. Like, you start hiding these records, I think you do a great disservice to everybody's ability to really understand important trends and issues in the state. So I see it as really as that you shouldn't take the one to go to the other. I think the media should be responsible in this, as we should be responsible in lots of things that we take the road about. Like, I felt that way about scanner traffic too, similar kind of deal, right? We don't just publicize scanner traffic out to the entire public, because it would have been irresponsible, but the state felt the need to allow, or the cities have felt this need to encrypt. So
police radio scanners, for those who don't know what she's talking about. Dave, really briefly, do you want to add to that?
No, I agree. I think that like Leanne said at the very start, it's a very different thing, a private company doing with it content versus what should be and always should remain a public record, especially anything along the felony line.
Got it. Thanks. Skipping around to a couple other subjects, I've put in the chat for those of you on Zoom 2 pieces by Liam Adams, who I think is on this call. Hi, Liam. And Corey Hutchins, the recent coverage of a yard sale robbery that actually didn't happen, and how a Westminster man's name was smeared in the process. I invite you to look at both of those links, because I think it's helpful and relevant to this topic. We have a really good question from the audience I was hoping somebody would ask, which is, should newsrooms consider similar policies for stories that aren't necessarily about crime? Say a teacher placed on administrative leave and investigated by their employer. We all know that was a big story at one point. I think there's a really interesting example that the Washington Post, once reviewed a concert pianist performance, saying that it was cartoon-like, and the pianist, a decade later wanted that removed. So if you could kind of speak to both of those examples.
I think, and as I tried to make that point earlier, I would say that the crime and the law enforcement ones is maybe half of the ones we deal with. We just had one that was an intern for Michael Bennett, who was fired for sending out an email where he seemed to be offering access to the senator, his campaign, in exchange for donations. And we wrote that up and put the guy's name in it. And it's been 10 years. And he's like, really? So we left the story up, but just changed it to an intern. And I think you would apply more or less the same sorts of thinking to a teacher on administrative leave and that kind of stuff as you would to a criminal record. To me, a different scenario might be fair comment and criticism, where you've written about, like, this was a person's opinion at the time. I don't think we've ever had an example, for example, where we've gone back and made a change. I can't remember anything to say an editorial or a column or an opinion piece. And that would include where they, get really mad at Mark Kislev because he said something mean about a player, and they'll threaten to sue, which is ridiculous. And, we're not going to go back and change that kind of stuff. I don't see that really happening so much, but never say never, but that's what I would think.
Got it. Dave?
Yeah, I agree. I think a review, especially, that you're asking someone to give their opinion and it's still their opinion. there isn't anything factually incorrect about it. Cartoonish is a great descriptor for a concert. So I think that's, that's what you're asking people to do in opinions, and that's a whole different kettle of fish, as someone would say. But I agree the same with, this policy for us has been mainly about crime stuff, but I have had, like I said, a couple of things that have come through. But, as far as the overall policy goes, I think it should be weighted and distributed equally around each story. It doesn't mean we're going to change all of them or any of them, but at least it should be considered.
Got it. We have a great question from the audience. Are broadcast journalists and newsrooms following suit? I'm not going to ask you two about this. I really would open it up to anyone, at least on Zoom, who's in the broadcast arena, who can talk about it.
I mean, they certainly do take it down. That's
Sorry.
for sure. Yeah.
What?
I said, I know they do, because a lot of times people will use it as their leverage. 9 News took it down. You take it down.
Got it. Got it. Any broadcast people out there? Allison Sherry, Nicole Vapp, who want to chime in on that? Well, if you do, please let us know. We have another great question, which is, how has third-party mugshot scraping sites affected the decision? This question touches on the argument that once something is published, it's out there, iterated and reiterated, which was a rationale for doing anything, basically.
I haven't had any third-party mugshot people approach me. So that hasn't influenced our decision. It's, like I said, it's been more about people reaching out to us. We have had, to Leanne's point, a few people lawyers hired who, have represented people. But other than that, that's the outreach that we get from third-party people.
Got it. Thanks.
Yeah, it wasn't effective for us either.
Got it. I'm going to shoot this out to everyone on Zoom as well. Have you been pressured by the higher ups or company owners to remove names, or for that matter, big advertisers? Come on, people.
We have not had big advertisers do it, but definitely over time, we've had businesses in stories. This especially happened back when we published Crime Blotter, back on your hub, which has been gone for quite some time. But like if you say a person was stabbed outside Joe's Bar and Grill, Joe's Bar and Grill would like their name taken out of that, please. And we don't do that. We have not so far ever removed a location name. We had a nursing home that had some really bad publicity and it got new ownership, and they wanted the name taken out of the old story about back when they were a bad nursing home. And, we didn't do that either. It's a different situation to me when it's a corporate entity.
Right. Like, change your name, people.
Yeah.
Yeah. Dave?
We haven't. And a good example, one of the first, kind of the opposite of that, one of the first crime stories I dealt with was when I got here, was an advertiser who spent quite a bit, got charged for giving drinks to people at a local club. And she called and was like, "You can't write that." And our publisher is like, "You do whatever." And she pulled her advertising for a week, and then she put it back because she realized that was her mistake, and there was a piece to it. But I haven't had, we've had the full support of our management group, leadership teams, all the way up on, this is a policy that we, to the point I think we discussed earlier with the EU doing it. And when I talked to Chris Quinn at Cleveland, there are some First Amendment attorneys in this country who are starting to think about, look, this could be a bigger push, and we're starting to see this in the state legislature. So I think that's something that's just going to continue. But no, we haven't had any kind of, you got to do it because of this kind of a thing.
We have a question on Zoom from Charles Greenwood. Why report on any arrest unless the story is already known? Why not wait until a conviction or acquittal those stories can only bias the court cases and are prone to accepting police versions of events.
I'll go with that first, Leanne, and I'd like to hear your opinion on this as well. But for us, we don't, like I said, I just had a conversation about two pieces, two stories that we're debating about if we wanted to write or not. For us, a lot of the decision also becomes a public safety issue. If there's somebody out there who's had, is getting charged with their 5th felony DUI, if there's somebody out there who's facing 4 counts of felony domestic violence or anything like that, for us, that's where we step in. If it's a public, people saw what happened in small towns, there was a big hubbub on Main Street, and here's the result of it. That's where we feel our duty is to inform the public and to get both sides. We don't write a crime story without making that effort beyond the police report to get a hold of the victim or the purpose and the suspect, because we want to give them their opportunity to speak beyond the police report. But we also know that these police reports, might have a missing piece, or they might want to say their piece and here's why I'm innocent. And we're going to give them that opportunity if we choose to write that crime story.
Leanne?
Yeah, I mean, there's legitimate public interest and news value in these arrests in higher profile cases. So I think that we would want to be able to continue to do that. And those cases can take a very long time to get through the system. And meanwhile, the story just sort of lingers out there, half done, and you're kind of strangely not including a bit of the information. It almost feels like you're hiding information then, as opposed to just making a good judgment decision. So I think we would continue. To do that. And Dave's right. And this is also part of our breaking news policy, just to put it down in actual writing, that the days of just assuming that report that came out from the police, which you can't even get anymore as easily as you used to begin with. So it's even more scrubbed than it used to be. I mean, at least you used to get something a little bit raw about what they actually saw and witness comments and stuff. And now it's really brought down to just their version of events. It does make it so much more important to get out in the community and talk to witnesses and all of that. But I'm not sure we're ready to go to the not report on any arrest.
Yeah, I'd like to add too that, by that argument, we wouldn't be reporting on things, cases in which the police are improperly charging or overcharging people, or where they're misusing their authority in arresting people. And so, the media has to pay very close attention to fairness, and you can't have like one set of rules when cases go one way and another set of rules when they go the other way. Yeah. We've got really only about 1 minute left, so I want to thank you both so much for not only being with us today, but also being early adopters of a really thought-provoking policy that I think a lot of people on the line who are journalists are really interested in, and will be thinking whether they're appropriate for their outlets. And I know that there are lawmakers and policy people and DAs on the line as well who have interests in this as well. So thank you everyone for joining us on a busy Wednesday afternoon. We like to do this as much as we can, these kinds of conversations at CoLab. And I just want to reiterate again that this panel was recorded and will be available, the recording, on our website and our YouTube channel, which is at the really top of the chat on Zoom. Thank you all, and have a fantastic day.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Susan. Thanks, Leanne.
Bye.